One of the most beautiful things about playing role-playing games is that you can develop your own mechanics very easily. It's a lot easier than if you're doing video games or something like that. In role-playing games, you can just write down a rule and then deploy it and see if your players like it or not. There's a whole bunch of communities online where people are sharing their own homebrew and they're sending it to each other. They're posting it into, Reddit or something like that. And occasionally you get YouTubers talking about what kind of homebrew rules they use, and I figured I'd make a video and talk about the ones I use. Welcome to Mystic Arts. My name is Daði. I'm a professional writer and director, and I've been DMing for 10 years. Now, before you go homebrewing any rule, I think you should ask yourself what it is you're trying to achieve, and is there a way that the game already does it that you could just lean into a little bit more? I think a common mistake early DMs do is they immediately start homebrewing everything and they break the whole game, and then their players go on Reddit and they complain that their DMs are doing things very weirdly. DMs might ban entire classes or species or whatever just because they feel like they're ruining the game for everybody, and I think you should be careful before going down that route. Ask yourself what you're trying to achieve. Does your rule help you achieve it, and is there an easier way for you to do this? A lot of the times the answer is you should be playing a different game. For me, I think 5th edition is the perfect game for me, but I think there are a couple of changes that I need to make in order for me to enjoy it just a little bit more. And they're all tiny, tiny little changes, but they're enough that they take the game from being basically perfect to me to being actually exactly what I want. The first homebrew rule I use is called Excursion Resting. It works like this. A short rest can be taken anywhere over the course of 8 hours, 6 of which must be sleeping and 2 can be light activity, and any rest is interrupted by the following: rolling initiative, casting a spell with a spell slot other than a cantrip. A long rest can be achieved after taking 3 consecutive short rests in a row in the same place, or in a single night in a safe haven. And I then define a safe haven as being a base of operations that the characters have. It could be something they've been given or taken or built. In 2024 rules, this would basically be a bastion. The goal of this rule is to make it so that when you go on excursions out into the wilderness, I can deploy travel encounters, and players could experience a 6 to 8 encounter adventuring day over the course of several in-game days, but it's just one long rest. This way, travel encounters have meaning. You can have a tiny little travel encounter against one owlbear or one goblin or whatever, but if somebody takes damage, that's damage they're carrying on with them all the way until they get to the dungeon, through the entire dungeon, and until they get back. This also allows me to use more of the monster manual for a longer amount of time. As the players get higher and higher levels, those goblins and bugbears or owlbears are all still relevant, even though the party has out-leveled them, because the encounter is still terrifying if it can deplete player resources, right? So much of 5th edition is actually about resource management. That's what this rule is meant to enhance. I have my own take on inspiration. I use 2 different kinds: heroic inspiration and historic inspiration. Heroic inspiration in my game works exactly the same as inspiration works in D&D, except also I allow players to give each other inspiration for good roleplay. I retain the right to say, no, that's just a funny joke, or that's just a poop gag or something that doesn't count. But if there's a good, meaningful roleplay that enhances the themes and tone of our adventure, I trust my players to give each other inspiration. I have no limitation on how often they can do it, and so far they haven't tried to metagame it because I'm always allowed to say that's not allowed. Historic inspiration is slightly different. In my games, when a historic event occurs, the player responsible will be awarded a coupon that I'll write on, and it'll say Historic Inspiration. The player can choose to hand that coupon in to me whenever they want, once, for a natural 20 on the roll. Basically, it's a coupon that says you get a free natural 20, and they hand it in, and they get a natural 20. But they only get historic inspiration when a big historic events occur. Discovering a new town, or changing the law, or unseating the emperor, something that will be written down in the history books. I always have issue with falling in D&D. Particularly, I think it isn't deadly enough. So at my table, we have double falling. Basically, you take 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 5 feet, instead of every 10. I used to use even more brutal rules for this, but I think this is better. The brutal rules I used were quadratic scaling, so you take 1d6, 3d6, 6d6, 10d6, but then I never wanted to throw anybody off a cliff. It was just too deadly. With double falling, it's 1d6 for every 5 feet fallen, and that makes it just deadly enough that it's scarier than regular falling. I also don't put any cap on it, by the way. It's not maxed out at 20, it just continues to scale up. And now, because it's slightly less deadly than the quadratic rules I used to use, it's enough that I'm willing to deploy it by having, a griffin swoop down and pick up a player character and drop them. I also say that if you jump willingly, you can reduce the fall damage by 4d6. You don't roll it, you just roll 4d6 less fall damage. which effectively means you can fall 20 feet for free if you chose to do it. I also use what I call unaligned progression. Basically, players don't all level up at the same rate. When the party does something that, is like taking down a faction or clearing a dungeon or fighting a particular bad guy or something, they get a milestone. I then say in order to get to the next level, you need 4 or 5 or 6 milestones or whatever. But I also have personal milestones. Players could get to a higher level than the others by doing their personal quests. Maybe they have something in their backstory that they're dealing with, or there's a bad guy that shows up and engages a character directly. When the player character manages to solve that quest line, however that works, they get a milestone, which could mean that that player gets to level up slightly earlier than the rest. The goal is not to have one player be out-leveling everybody else. Eventually, that player who out-levels everybody just gets fewer personal quests for a bit, and the spotlight shifts to those who are lower level as they catch up. I also did this weird thing recently with Unaligned Progression where I decided that in order to get from 2nd level to 3rd level, characters had to do certain kinds of downtime jobs in order to become their subclass. I wouldn't spring on a system like this to your players unawares. They really need to be on board with it because you're kind of changing the bones of how the game works. But basically I told them that, for instance, in order to become the Hunter Ranger, you have to go hunt a creature. Or in order to become an Arcane Trickster Rogue, you have to go learn spellcasting from a spellcaster. These downtime jobs are then broken down into a DC for rolling on and a time that it takes to do. So a downtime job might take 100 hours to do, and the DC might be 15. Then whenever you spend 8 hours on it, you can roll a skill check. You have to just argue for what skill you think makes sense. And if you get a 15 or higher, you made a breakthrough that day, and your 8 hours count as 16 hours. This is the downtime job system I use. Basically, it makes it so that I can take any task and I can make it be a downtime task. Let's say a player finds a firearm, because I use Firearm Rules, and the firearm is broken. They might decide that they want to go fix the gun. I'll figure out how long it takes and how difficult it is. I'll assign it hours and a DC. And then whenever they work 8 hours or more on it, basically a full day, they get to roll and they might get a breakthrough and get 16 hours. The great thing about a downtime job system is that the players can kind of ask to do anything. One player said they wanted to write a history book for this place they're in. And I said, okay, here's the DC, here's the time it takes. And a prerequisite is that you have to have a book you can write into. So they have to go buy a book and then they can do it. One of my characters is a lawyer and they wanted to incorporate a company because in my setting we play with corporations. I put a prerequisite. You need this other lawyer's initial paperwork because they'd gotten started. And then you get a DC and some hours and then you have to have a reward. So what happens if they incorporate the company? They no longer automatically fail audits, which I guess means that if they don't do it, I'll have to have an audit. One thing I do is I have permanent injuries. When a character dies, if it's still early on in the campaign and we're kind of in the tutorial levels and we don't really think it's time for people to have death completely on the table yet, we have a permanent injury system. I have a table with 10 possible injuries on it, and when something happens, I can either roll on the table or pick one based on what happened. So for instance, a player character of mine fell a great height, and I decided that he is now limping, and his speed is permanently reduced by 5 feet. Now there's punishment for death, and the punishment isn't just make another character and everything you've done up until this point is dead, but there is this lingering permanent thing that you have to carry around with him. Later, by the way, that character got killed by an Ankheg, and we decided he could get a second permanent injury. I don't know if I'd allow a third, but the second permanent injury was cracked ribs. So whenever he takes the dash action, he takes 2d6 damage. Right now they're level 2, so he could dash and snap some rib of his and collapse unconscious. I think that's a lot of fun. One of my players got killed by an inflict wounds and got a missing eye, and she now wears an eye patch. And that was AB's character. AB told me that she wanted to keep the eye patch, she liked the visual of it, but she wanted to no longer be punished for it. The visual, AB told me she wanted to keep the eye patch, she liked the visual of it, but it comes with a punishment. She has disadvantage on ranged attacks from more than 30 feet away, which is just how a Cyclops works. I stole that and made it a permanent injury. And she said she doesn't want to have that punishment anymore, but she wants to keep the eye patch. So ideas like using a magic eyeball or something to get her eyesight back, she's not interested in. So I told her she could have a downtime job. The prerequisite is she has to be trained by someone with firearms proficiency or proficiency in martial weapons. If she completes it, she no longer has a detriment due to her permanent injury. The DC is 20. It takes her 200 hours. But remember, whenever she succeeds the roll, She gets double the time for 8 hours becomes 16, and it doesn't cost her any money. Well, except it does cost her bullets. I told her that she has to spend 20 bullets for every 8 hours. So she has to go buy bullets. Another thing that's beautiful about RPGs in general is that making your own RPG from scratch is also possible. You don't need to know about game engines, you just need to know about game design. Fellow DungeonTuber Indestructible Boy is launching his own Kickstarter for Vagabond. That guy is an incredible designer, and the art in here by Maxwell is gorgeous. I recommend you go check it out. Due to changes in tariffs in the United States, the first Kickstarter is having some trouble, so Terran's launching a second one in order to get the first one through the finish line. If you haven't heard of this game by now, you should absolutely go check it out. If you're into OSR-style games, I think this is some of the coolest you will have ever seen. Now, I've talked about the Firearm Rules a bunch. They are a constant thing in my setting, and if you want access to them, they're on the Mystic Art Patreon for Adept tier members and above. We also use our own homebrew class, the Warlord, available on the Adept tier above as well. If you back on the Adept tier, you get the whole backlog, which right now is just 2 things, the Warlord and Firearm Rules. And eventually, probably next month, I'll put up the Hexcrawl Rules, which is another one of my homebrew systems. I have a very simple hexcrawl system. I use 3-mile hexes because that means you can see into the next hex from any other hex because the distance to the horizon is 3 miles. It also means that there's no traveling half hexes or quarter hexes in a day. You always travel at least 1 hex. There is no fractions. Because why would we have fractions? Go ahead and head over to the Patreon where you'll get access to the Firearm Rules and the Warlord class. And it'll also help support this channel directly, which is run by me and my girlfriend, and we'll really appreciate your support. That's all for now, and that's where we'll pick it up next time. Thanks so much for watching this video, and if you're feeling especially generous, consider liking the video, commenting, subscribing, and hitting the bell to be notified when we release new videos. Until next time, keep studying the mystic arts.